Hello, my name is Jeff Kindhart. I'm a horticulturist with the University of Illinois, and today I'm going to talk to you about basics of commercial vegetable production. I think as we broach this topic, a good place to start is why would one want to raise vegetables? There are a variety of reasons why an individual might begin a vegetable production enterprise, and we've listed a few on the slide. One of the reasons why one might start in vegetable production is that vegetables afford a much greater income potential when compared to that of traditional corn and soybean row crop production. Unfortunately, this does come with some trade-off. They also have a much greater labor demand when we compare vegetable production to that of row crop farming. And so what we wind up seeing is basically a trade-off between equipment and labor. The good news is for an individual wanting to get started in an enterprise, we don't have as much equipment cost with vegetable production up front when we compare it to corn and soybean farming. For example, there's no $250,000 combine required, which is going to be an essential piece of equipment for any row crop operation. Another reason why vegetable production has some appeal to individuals is that it provides a good alternative, or in some cases addition, to row crop operations. So we see a couple of different reasons why an individual might start raising produce or vegetables in specific. And one is they have a limited amount of space that they're able to farm, and vegetables will afford for a viable operation on small acreage. If you're wanting to have a successful tomato operation in the state of Illinois, 15 acres would be considered huge. In order to have a viable row crop operation, it's going to require several hundred, if not 1,000 acres or more for the operation to be capable of cash flowing. We also see in some cases that rather than an alternative to row crops, they may be in addition to row crops. And that can be for a couple of different reasons. In some cases, as family members get older and need to provide income for themselves, we may have a situation where the family is doing quite well on their family farm, but they don't have the ability to divide the farm into half and support two families. In other words, like in a case where a child has grown up and they are now out on their own, or they've got a family of their own, they're needing their own income and the original owners still need their income. We can't divide this farm up and get two different sets of incomes out of it, but we may be able to remove a little bit of the acreage from the corn and soybean production and convert them to specialty crop production such as vegetables and be capable of supporting both families from the existing resource that already exists. We also see some farmers wanting to diversify their row crop operation, and in some cases they're wanting to diversify to spread out their risk. In other cases, it's to utilize labor more efficiently throughout the growing season. But we can see vegetables being used for diversification in traditional row crop farming operations as well. One of the exciting things about being a horticulturist at this point in time is that recently the demand for local foods has increased dramatically. This has been true over the course of the last 5 years or perhaps a bit longer, and it's evident by looking at something as simple as the number of farmers markets that exist both in Illinois and throughout the United States. The number of farmer markets have gone up dramatically, and the reason for that is that the citizens are wanting to purchase local commodity from growers that they know. And it's not just farmers markets where we're seeing this increased demand. We're also seeing increased demand in restaurants and grocery stores. When you walk through the produce aisle at your local grocery store, it is not at all uncommon for you to see signage that is denoting when specific items are locally produced. This is a marketing benefit for the grocery store, and they have an interest in purchasing additional items locally when they become available. Food service companies that supply restaurants are increasing their demands because the restaurants are wanting more and more local produce, and in fact some restaurants make their stock and trade by trying to cater so that they only sell local commodity. Additionally, a third component is that government institutions in the state of Illinois have been mandated by legislation that by the year 2020 they're going to need to purchase 20% of their food from local sources. So the demand has been increasing, and we anticipate this to continue to increase for the foreseeable future. In many areas, the demand is simply greater than the ability to supply. When we get into large metropolitan areas, there's simply no way they're going to raise all of the produce in the immediate area, but we typically tend to define local as being commodity produced within the state, and this demand is in fact very great. Another advantage of vegetable crops is that they can be a part-time operation. It's the kind of thing where you can start small, keep your current off-farm job. However, fruit and vegetable production is not for everyone, and there are some pitfalls that many people just do not want to deal with, and you need to be aware of them before you make a decision to start a vegetable enterprise. Vegetable production requires intense management, and in many cases we see that the crop will require daily monitoring for things like pest or irrigation, and require actions perhaps even on a daily basis, such as turning off and on irrigation. There's a great deal of physical work, and this has to be done in a wide range of weather. It gets very, very warm in the summertime. In fact, it might even get hot, and regardless, you have to be out there working in the crop. It requires a need to invest time and money before payback. Another problem with vegetable production, or reason why it might not be well suited, you simply cannot abandon your activities on the farm and move to other concerns. In other words, summer vacations become much more difficult if you're trying to also be a commercial farm enterprise. Vocational truck farming or commercial vegetable production is not recreational gardening. It will require a much greater commitment to care and production, and additionally there are other time constraints that will be required, such as harvesting and marketing of the commodity. Successful operations, and they're very diverse in the state of Illinois, but they tend to have some things in common. And successful operations tend to have as their number one goal producing quality produce. And by quality produce, we mean not necessarily just blemish-free and pretty, but also produce that is high in its consumer appeal in terms of things like flavor, for example. In order to do this, you must be effective at crop management and pest management. We must have good harvest practices, harvesting on a timely manner, and also taking care of the commodity even after we have successfully harvested it. Another thing that we see as a hallmark of those operations that are successful is that they tend to market only high quality produce. We do not take items that are subpar to the marketplace that is our number one market. Now, that's not to say, for example, in the case of bell peppers, we may have bell peppers that are incredibly pretty. Those are going to go to the farmer's market. We're going to have some others that are misshapen. They're free of blemish, insect, or disease problems, but they're not shaped such that they're attractive. So we may wind up taking those to what's called a chopper market, and really good operations have both of these kinds of markets, both their high quality top dollar market and additionally market for stuff that is not top quality, such as choppers. One of the places you could sell chopper peppers to would be somewhere like a local pizza parlor that would cut them up and put them on their salad bar or utilize them in pizzas, and they're also wanting local commodity. You're getting some money for your less than number one produce, and it's able to expand your income potential. Another hallmark of successful operations is that they have a great idea about what their marketing plan and strategy is going to be. They have an idea of what quantities of produce are going to be in demand at the local market, and the timing for marketing their commodity. Additionally, part of market knowledge would be knowing things like regional preferences. Parts of the state, straight neck squash sell very well and crook neck will not sell at all, and in other parts of the state the exact reverse of that is true. Additionally, as you're trying to identify and become familiar with markets, always look for ethnic makeup and preferences in the area where you will be marketing. In many cases, these ethnic markets are largely untapped and represent a great potential for an individual that is getting started in vegetable production. Successful vegetable operations also, we see that the operator has a very strong work ethic, or if they don't have a strong work ethic, they at least have access to a great labor pool. There is lots. Some tips for those of you that are in this getting started phase would be start small and expand as you increase your knowledge and experience. Don't start out raising 10 acres of tomatoes. That likely will not end well. Start with a smaller size operation and develop your marketing as you develop your capacity to be successful. We need to be careful not to exceed our initial marketing capacity when we're beginning our operation. Additionally, I think it's always a good idea to try to not get bigger before getting better. Do everything you can to become more efficient and better at your craft before you become a larger operation. If possible, start with crops that you have some experience with growing. And if you have that experience in a recreational gardening sort of background, please be aware that commercial production practices are often very different, and you need to become comfortable with the commercial production systems and ultimately the marketing of what you're doing before you expand your operation. To begin a small farm enterprise, there are some things that will be required. Certainly you're going to have some amount of land. How much depends a little bit on your desired goal, and we do see some operations starting as small as a half acre or perhaps even less, and 10 acres is not at all an uncommon size for a mixed operation to begin with. In other words, somebody that's going to raise more than one vegetable crop, they may begin on 10 acres of land. But in general, we're talking about a much smaller land resource requirement for specialty crop production in comparison to row crop production. You will require some equipment and machinery, and exactly what you need in terms of machinery and equipment will vary greatly depending on the size of your operation and the crops that you're trying to produce. It can range from anything from just a few hand tools to a gas-powered rototiller and some hand tools, all the way up through multiple tractors and multiple pieces of tractor-powered equipment. You will be required to have the capacity to do hand labor, even in these operations that are very large in size and very well established, that have lots of tractors and lots of tractor-driven implements. There is still a great deal of hand labor in virtually all vegetable crop production in the state of Illinois. You will need at least some capital. The amount of capital required will vary by crop and the size of the operation. Again, one of the beauties, I think, of specialty crop production and vegetables is that it does afford itself to starting on a small scale operation, which has a limited amount of initial startup cost. But do beware that the less the investment, it's probably also going to be less on the revenues that you're going to receive. You do need to have a basic understanding of what markets are available to you and the current and potential demands for whatever crops that you want to grow. We do occasionally see growers get into trouble because they've read an article in some popular press magazine about how valuable this crop is, but they don't realize that there's only a very, very finite demand for that particular crop. So beware of what it is that you're going to be able to sell. One of the problems and things that make people uncomfortable when they are beginning these enterprises is there are some things that you simply probably will not have as you begin to start vegetable production. And one is experience growing vegetables as a profit-making business. You can't have experience doing it until you begin doing it. You typically are a little bit short on the knowledge of growing practices for the specific crops that you're raising, and most of the specific equipment that would be useful in many cases we don't have starting out. And probably the most difficult thing for beginners is that when you are just starting out, you simply cannot have an established market. One of the things that we typically hear people say is don't grow anything until you have a market, but it's pretty hard for an individual to have a market for something that they've never produced. So that's a bit of a cliche, but it is uncomfortable knowing that you haven't got experience marketing and you will likely not begin with an established market. But take faith, neither did anybody else that is now a commercial vegetable. You're going to need to do a good job with record keeping, and that means keeping track of all of your income, expenses, sales tax, and perhaps most importantly, labor. We're wanting to do this to make money, not to make friends, and the only way we know if we're making money is if we know exactly how much we have invested in the crop that we have produced. And that absolutely should include a return on your investment of labor. Your time does have value, and make sure you're getting a return on the investment of your time. You're also going to need to take good notes on field production information, things like what date did you plant this year, what varieties did you raise, what were some specific environmental conditions, did we have an early frost or a late frost, what pesticides did we use, and were they effective or not effective in controlling the pests that we saw. These field notebooks that we have are invaluable reference tools during future production years. Lots and lots of times we see growers carry a calendar journal in their truck, or they keep it at their kitchen table, and at the end of every day they make notes on what was happening. And when we do that, that allows us to go back next year and go, last year I had this tomato variety and the timing was perfect. You can go back through your notebook. You can see what date you planted on, what the variety was that you've raised. And I'll be honest with you, if you rely simply on your memory, oftentimes that results in mistakes being made. Additionally, this record keeping is going to allow us to make sure that we are pricing our commodity at a level such that we are getting a return on all. Also, for beginning farmers, and again, this is going to be covered in the course of this program that you have signed up for, the Beginning Farmer program that you're enrolled in, but it is important to remember there will be some business planning required, things like insurance, and not just liability insurance that you're probably familiar with, but also crop insurance. What happens if somebody eats your strawberries and decide that they've made you ill? Well, there are insurance policies for that. And other business planning related kinds of things, labor consideration, taxes and accounting, some food safety issues such as farm safety plans and good agricultural practices, in addition traceability of the commodity that you're raising. These are all part of business planning things that will be covered in greater depth later in this course. We also have to remain cognizant of zoning laws that may impact you, particularly in urban settings. Typically not a concern for rural areas, but they can be very impactful on plans for urban farming operations. Marketing is likely the one item that most people that get started may have no experience in. Most people that begin probably have raised vegetables in a garden setting before, but they've never done any marketing, and so this is new territory for pretty much all beginners. But marketing typically falls into one of two categories. You're either marketing directly to a consumer, or you are marketing at a wholesale level, selling it to someone who is going to turn around and resell it to the end user. Of these two types of marketing, when we look at direct marketing, some examples commonly employed in Illinois would include farmers markets, the utilization of CSAs or community supported agriculture. These would be situations where you have a list of subscribers and each of them gets a percentage of what you raise on your farm in exchange for their dollar contributions to you for their subscription. Other examples of direct marketing could be retail on the farm, something like a roadside stand. In the wholesale arena of marketing, there are produce auctions that are used in the state of Illinois. We also have the South Water Market, which is a terminal wholesale market located in Chicago, Illinois, and a lot of our growers take items to the St. Louis terminal market as well. You can wholesale to local stores or restaurants, and we're seeing an increase in interest from places like hospitals, nursing homes, and also schools. There are marketing cooperatives, but there are very few examples in the state of Illinois. And we see producers typically using combinations of the above. We have some direct marketing and some wholesaling. There are a variety of different ways that individual farms make the marketing work for them. As marketing is such an important thing for the beginning operation, there are a myriad of reference materials, books, websites dedicated to marketing that have lots of information. Some of it will be applicable to your operation, some of it will not. But here are just a few tips. For example, someone going to a farmer's market should bear in mind appearance is a big part of what's going to make a sale. You should make your displays neat and attractive, and they should have in them clean, high quality produce. Quality, and again I reiterate, that includes eating quality, not just being blemish free and pretty, leads to loyal customers. If someone has been coming to your stand and buying tomatoes, for example, and like the quality, it's likely they're not going to come and look for you just because somebody else is cheaper. If they've been pleased with the quality they've been receiving from your stand, you're likely going to have customer loyalty and repeat business. It's important that we clearly mark the prices of our produce in the farmer's market, and when practical or possible, try to provide a variety of produce rather than a single item. It tends that vendors that have more than one commodity to sell are often more successful than those that rely on just a single commodity at the farmer's market. While you're working your display, be friendly, clean, and courteous. Lots of the growers will take with them an overhead shelter. That does a couple of things. One, it keeps your customers comfortable because they're in the shade. It also keeps your produce that's on the table or display from overheating and getting sunburnt, and allows you to maintain a higher quality on what you're going to sell. In some cases we can provide samples, in some we cannot. That whether or not we provide samples is going to be a function of a couple of different things. What are the rules for the individual market you're at? Some markets allow it and some markets do not. There's typically a market master associated with the farmer's market, and they have a set of rules that you have to abide by if you're going to be a vendor at their facility. In cases like peaches, for example, it's easy to provide a sample. You simply hand them a peach in a paper towel and let them have a sample. In other cases where we're dealing with something that's going to have to be cut, such as a watermelon, that becomes much more difficult, and at that point there are going to be health department rules and regulations that apply in addition to the individual farmer market rules that may be applicable. Another good tip is to provide recipes and sheets that provide them with information on how to best prepare and utilize the produce that you're selling. If you're going to a farmer's market, beware that we have to have scales certified if we're selling by the pound. and failure to sell from a certified scale can result in a substantial fine for yourself and your farming operation. And make sure that if we're using boxes, we are using boxes that properly measure out the amount that is stated. An example of this, typically, even though the box may be marked half peck and peck in the case of peaches, or some growers sell tomatoes this way, a lot of times growers will sell them by large box and small box so that the Illinois Department of Ag's weights and measures rules are not applicable, and you don't get yourself in trouble if in fact the box that you bought that's labeled a peck box doesn't actually contain a peck when filled. Also beware that there are sales tax that need to be collected, and there will be additional information about that kind of information in classes. One of the first decisions a producer has to make is to decide whether or not they're going to raise using conventional methods or organic methods. And often this decision is based on the individual opinions or beliefs of the producer rather than based on marketing situations. But be cautious and look at what is the premium return for organic produce in the area, and what is the market for organic produce locally where you're going to be selling at. Organic crops usually command a higher price. The amount of the premium for organic produce varies from location to location within the state, and we had to make sure that the premium that we're receiving is enough to offset what is typically lower yields associated with organic production systems. Producing crops organically is usually more expensive because organic does not in fact mean that it's not going to be utilizing pesticides. It just means that the pesticides that we use are from a group of materials that is on the OMRI list, or the Organic Material Registration. Also, organic production is going to be more labor intensive typically than conventional production, and so we need to get a return on that additional investment in labor. If you're going to sell and produce organically, it is required that if your annual sales exceed $5,000, you are certified, and there are a number of different agencies that certify operations as being organic. If you have interest in that, there are websites associated with the USDA that will provide you with additional information on the organic certification process. In addition to that, there is an eOrganic website that provides you with a myriad of information, and there is also an Illinois Organic Growers Association, the link that you see below. Once you've decided how you're going to raise, whether you're going to be organic or conventional, regardless of that decision, you're going to require some equipment to start your venture. Exactly what equipment you need and the size of that equipment is going to vary with what crop you're raising and the size of your operation. Again, small operations may get by with simply hand tools and a gasoline tiller, while larger operations will have multiple tractors. They'll have tillage implements, transplanters, planters, sprayers, plastic mulch layers, plastic mulch lifters, and more and more. Again, the size of the operation and the crop being produced will have impact on exactly which pieces of equipment you need, and we will cover more on equipment later in the class that you are enrolled in. Additionally, if you're wanting to produce vegetables year-round in Illinois, as we are a temperate climate, it will require that you have a greenhouse, and we're seeing more and more growers using high tunnels. They're not producing year-round, but they are producing earlier and later than the growing season outdoors would allow through the utilization of high tunnels. And high tunnels will also be a topic of discussion in much more detail in future. Some of the basic kinds of equipment Hand tools will include things like hoes and shovels. Tillers, they may be one of two types, either a walk-behind that has its own gasoline-mounted engine, or some growers use larger tractor-mounted tillers. As operations grow, we find tractors become very, very useful, as well as planters, plastic mulch layers, and transplanters. Packing and washing equipment becomes very important as operations increase in size. With a very small operation, you may be able to wash and pack your produce just straight into boxes, but as operations increase in size and scope, then the need for specialized equipment involved with packing and washing the produce becomes of paramount importance. Larger operations will typically have tractor-mounted cultivators and sprayers. You may also have fertilizer spreaders and all kinds of other pieces of equipment. In some cases, a crop may require that you have a specific need to do something, and you may wind up even designing some of your own equipment. There is an awful lot of homemade equipment being utilized on vegetable farms in Illinois and throughout the Midwest. When we look at something as simplistic as hose, there are a variety of types, and it largely comes down to what your preference is for what you're most. When we look at seeders, again, these can vary from these smaller seeders that you see here all the way up to large planters like you see out in corn and soybean fields throughout the. There's just a picture of some of the pieces of equipment, and these were all taken on pictures of farms in Illinois. In the upper left, there's a horse being utilized to cultivate tomatoes in Illinois. Upper right is a sprayer that would be typical of a conventional production farm in Illinois. The bottom left is a horseradish digger, and it would be very similar to a potato digger. And the bottom right is a plastic mulch layer. You can lay plastic mulch and make raised beds by hand, but if you're doing very many of them, it pretty much becomes incumbent upon you to purchase a piece of equipment like you see in the bottom right hand corner that makes the raised beds and lays the plastic mulch and trickle irrigation line. Other equipment that is useful, it's nice to have a soil thermometer, know what the temperature is. For example, shrunken sweet corn, it really doesn't germinate very well if soil temperatures are cool, so we need to be able to monitor what the soil temperature is prior to planting. Sweet corn seed is very expensive, and there's no need of planting it out if in fact the soil temperature is such that it's not going to germinate. You will likely need irrigation equipment, and irrigation, the statement that is commonly used is irrigation is one of those items that you're going to pay for whether you buy it or not. And what that statement means is simply this: if you purchase irrigation equipment, you're going to, of course, have the expense of buying it. If you don't purchase irrigation equipment, your losses in crop yield are such that you could have paid for the irrigation equipment by the additional revenue that would have been generated from the additional crop that would have been available for harvest. Harvesting and marketing equipment, again, this varies a bit from crop to crop in terms of what your specific needs are, and it can be everything from a spade for digging potatoes to a knife for harvesting asparagus. We will need tubs and totes to gather the produce as we're harvesting it, and we will typically have some kind of equipment, and it can be as simple as a horse trough or a stock tank to a very complicated packing line that will be involved in the cleaning, processing, and packaging of the produce that you harvest. Equipment for season extensions can vary from row covers to low tunnels to high tunnels, wall of water, things that you likely have seen before. There are lots of different techniques or devices or pieces of equipment that are available that allow us to extend our growing season. As operations get very large in size, and it doesn't take very much in terms of growth from the garden to a market garden, as we get to this transition where we become commercial in our scope, the need for coolers to keep our produce at top quality becomes very important. And we'll have talks about this also, but these can vary from very large coolers that you can actually drive forklifts in to a very small corner of a machine shed where we've walled off a room and used a device called a CoolBot in conjunction with a window air conditioning unit to provide us with a cold storage. The chart on this page, which is on ATRA's website, provides a good overall guesstimate on kinds of equipment that will be required based on size of operation. And again, the website's contained at the bottom of this, and there are lots of good fact sheets and pieces of information on the Appropriate Technology Transfer for Rural Areas website. What crops are we going to grow? Well, the best crop to grow is that one which you can successfully raise and market that provides the greatest return on your investment. Don't necessarily grow the crop that is easiest for you to raise or that you're most familiar with, but instead figure out which crops are going to allow you the greatest profit and try to concentrate your efforts on those crops. Which crops are easy to raise and sell, which crops provide us the best return, and crops that you feel comfortable in growing. If we can get all three of those to line up, your likelihood for success greatly increases. We also have to take a look at, in terms of what crop, what are our land, labor, capital, and equipment resources. For example, what is involved in raising an acre of staked tomatoes in terms of capital and labor investment would be much different than what is required to raise an acre of sweet corn in terms, again, of how much labor and what is the initial outlay of capital going to be that is required prior to harvest. In Illinois, we raise everything from herbs like anise all the way through plants like zucchini. The myriad of crops that are available for production or that can be produced in the state of Illinois is quite large. Major crops in Illinois tend to revolve around things like sweet corn, pumpkin, squash, melons, cucumbers, pickles, green beans, or snap beans as they're sometimes called, tomatoes. These are all crops that are readily grown and readily marketed at the farmer's market. Crops that are a little bit less in scope in Illinois but can all be successfully raised and successfully marketed. Potatoes, asparagus, peppers, beets, carrots. Almost all of the vegetable crops can be raised in Illinois. You simply have to decide which ones are you going to be able to raise successfully and which ones are you going to be able to market. The following chart contains crops that can be raised in Illinois, and it denotes whether or not they are typically marketed retail or wholesale, what their labor requirements are in terms of low, medium, and high, do they require any specialized equipment, and what is the pest management level. Is they typically something that are going to require a great deal of pest management, or items that are going to have not so much of a requirement management. And this chart again is a continuation. Another decision that we're going to have to make is when do we plant things, and that varies greatly depending on which end of the state you are at. Illinois is a terribly long state. It encompasses a couple of USDA hardiness zones, and there's great variation for when you would plant items in northern Illinois compared to southern Illinois. This is a fact sheet that, although relatively old, is still filled with useful information about planting dates for some of the various crops, and this should be available online. And on this chart, not only does it tell you the time of the year, but it gives you additional information in terms of the amount of seed or plants that are required per 100 foot of row, and an estimation of yield, things that can be very useful as you're trying to make some of your initial decisions when you're just getting started. How many pounds of bush bean seed do I need to buy? That information is all contained in this chart right here. Here's another resource. It's a website that will have additional information on what yield expectations might be for small scale operations, and it also includes information on the impact of yield from mixed stands where you're growing more than one item together. Another decision that you're going to have to make in this beginning phase is you're going to have to decide what cultivar or variety that you're going to use, and we will have a whole course based on, we will spend all morning talking about cultivar and variety selection one day in this beginning farmer program. But do bear in mind that cultivars are different. Within tomato, there are lots and lots of different cultivars, and they may vary from everything to small yellow cherries to great big purple or even green mature fruit in some cases. So cultivars are different in their response to the environment. Some are very widely adapted, some only work well in specific niche environments. They also can vary in growth habit and fruit shape, their yield potential, and how long it takes them to mature, as well as color, flavor, disease and insect resistance, their ability to withstand rough handling, their potential to make profit are all variable depending on which variety that you select. And this difference can be in the tens of thousands of dollars per acre in the case of tomatoes, for example. Select cultivars or variety based on a variety of things, but among those things should be some information about what's going to yield well and what is going to meet your marketing requirements. And so how do we get ideas about what to grow? Well, we can obviously look through seed and plant stock catalogs, but a cautionary note, there's never any varieties listed in the catalog with an asterisk beside it that says this one does really poor in Illinois. They're all wonderful according to the catalog, so you might want to do additional homework beyond just shopping with your eyes and look at things like research reports such as that is available at the website you see here in the blue link called the Midwest Vegetable Variety Trial Reports. You can come to extension programs. We do have grower schools throughout the state, as well as a statewide meeting called the Illinois Specialty Crops Conference that's occurring in January. You can visit with other growers or talk with producers at farmers markets, but be careful. Sometimes they don't always tell you exactly what it is that they're growing and don't necessarily share all of their secrets. Ultimately, after you gain more experience, you're going to select cultivars based on your experience and what has worked well for you, and you're going to, as new varieties become available, talk with suppliers and ask them, how does this variety compare with the particular variety that you've already got experience raising. Ideally, we would like to select cultivars that offer a high amount of disease resistance. Plants can be resistant from everything from verticillium, fusarium, nematode, tobacco mosaic virus. There are lots and lots of different disease resistances that are available for different crops, and if all other things are equal, we would obviously prefer to have a more disease resistant cultivar compared to a disease susceptible cultivar. Unfortunately, in the real world, oftentimes things aren't always all other things equal, and what we find out is that we use disease resistance when we can, but we have to make sure that the horticultural characteristics for the particular variety are also. Hardiness is another thing that is a concern or something that you need to understand as a beginning vegetable grower. And some crops are hardy. That means they can be planted 4 weeks before the last frost in the spring. Things like broccoli, cabbage, onions, peas, spinach, turnips. These are all plants that can tolerate being frosted. Other crops are considered semi-hardy, and we normally try to deal with them on 2 weeks, one side or the other, of when we're going to have a frost. And examples here would include carrots, lettuce, potatoes, beets, and radish. They are somewhat frost hardy, but they are not as frost hardy as those that were in the previous group that we had talked about. Tender crops need to be planted only after danger of frost has passed. These would be things like green beans and corn. Then we also have warm season vegetables, which are considered to be very tender, and a lot of times growers will wait 2 weeks after the last frost in the spring to plant these. These crops tend to do better in higher heat situations, and they would include things like cucumbers, eggplants, lima beans, melons, squash, okra, sweet potatoes, pepper, and tomatoes. When is the last frost? Well, it depends on exactly what your location is. The average frost-free date is contained in the chart on the left, and you can kind of pick out where you're at in the state and figure out when the average last frost date would be. But bear in mind, average by definition means that about half of the time it frosts after this date, and about half of the time it is earlier than that is when the last spring frost occurred. You should also look at the chart on the bottom, or on the right-hand side of this slide, and look at what the 90% chance date is, and you'll notice that it gets much later. In other words, in southern Illinois, the 50% frost date is April 7th, but we have had frost as late as May the 8th in Pope County, where I'm located at here. So there can be a pretty great variation between average frost-free date and the 100% frost-free date. This diagram shows the first frost date on the other end of the growing season, the first frost date to occur in the fall based on average from 1971 to the year 2000. Again, just as was the case with the spring, this is an average percent date. That difference between the first frost in the fall and the last frost in the spring is what gives us our growing season. And if you'll look, there's about a month's difference in growing season between southern Illinois and northern Illinois. So there's great variation in market crops. To get around the impact of frost, many growers are going to using techniques that allow for season extension. Season extension is simply a method of protecting the crops for cold in the spring or the fall, and thus we extend the growing season. It's very beneficial to allow for increasing the diversity of crops, particularly early in the season. It does have some disadvantages. The disadvantages of season extension is that there are the additional expenses and labor associated with the structures or techniques that are involved in your season extension program. But it does have a great advantage, one that is sufficient enough to outweigh the disadvantages for many producers, and that is if you're the first to be on market with a crop such as, for example, tomatoes, it allows you to get a higher price in the early season when you have no one else around you that has tomatoes available for sale. In addition to that, in the case of high tunnels, for example, we can also see some decrease in disease issues. The produce that comes out of these tunnels tend to be very, very high in quality, and their consumer demand tends to increase. Here are some examples of season extension techniques. We can simply use row covers, which is in the bottom left-hand picture. What you're looking at in the bottom left-hand picture is the use of row covers forming a low tunnel that is actually being done inside of a high tunnel structure. High tunnels are, by definition, structures that we can walk underneath of. Low tunnels are structures that are much shorter in stature. And some growers will use just low tunnels on their own, as you see in the upper right-hand picture. Here's some more pictures of low tunnels above and to the right, and a high tunnel in the bottom left-hand picture. The picture on the right, sometimes that technique where we've got a very small low tunnel, that technique is sometimes referred to as cloaching. Though there is less emphasis on fall crops as compared to spring, there are some crops that respond very positively to production in the fall season and tend to have relatively good consumer appeal. examples of the crops that do really well: leafy greens and cole crops. Until you've eaten broccoli that has actually been frosted before harvest, it's hard to imagine how good broccoli can taste. Broccoli produced in Maine summer season tends to be relatively bitter, and it tastes much more mild after it has actually had a frost or two on the crop prior to being harvested. Fall crops do present special moisture challenges. We can have a lot of insects in the fall of the year. It's very often difficult to locate a source of transplants for things like broccoli or cabbage or cauliflower that would normally be set in sometime in mid-July for fall harvest. Again, on fall crops, if one wants to, you can use season extension techniques, things like row covers, to extend the season even beyond when we would normally have to conclude our growing. Another decision that new growers need to understand is that some crops are transplanted, other crops are direct seeded. And in some cases we can do either one with a crop. Transplants have some advantages in that they give you a head start on the season compared with direct seeding. They avoid losing seed to problems like mice or those kinds of things that would be in field settings. And seedling decay in cold, wet soils, we eliminate that problem by simply going out and establishing transplants rather than seed. But direct seeding is much less costly than transplanting. In a transplant situation, you've had to raise the transplant typically for 4 or 5, maybe even 6 weeks in a heated greenhouse environment. And with direct seeding, we don't have all the expenses associated with development of that transplant. We simply went out to the field and placed the seed with a planter or by hand in the field setting, and so the cost is greatly reduced. Whether we use transplanting or direct seeding in general depends on what the crop is that we're going to raise. For example, we almost always use transplants for tomato production, although in some states there are direct seeded tomatoes produced. In Illinois, we almost always use direct seeding methods for sweet corn, although in Illinois there is a small amount of sweet corn that is actually transplanted. Transplanted crops typically include tomatoes, peppers, cole crops, things like broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflower, and sweet potatoes are normally established by transplants of what's called a slip. Direct seeded crops in Illinois normally include sweet corn, green beans, lettuce, beets, and peas. Some of the cucurbit crops can go either way. For example, some producers that are wanting to raise gourds, which is a cucurbit crop, may opt for transplants because they get an extra 4 weeks in the growing season because they establish their plant inside before taking it outdoors for field production. It allows them to start a full month earlier and begin with a much larger plant, which in the end for some of the gourds is required in order to get the gourd finished before the fall growing season concludes. So squash and pumpkins can go either way. We do see very little in terms of pumpkin transplanting, but we do see quite a bit of squash that is transplanted. Do you want to start your own transplants? Growing your own transplants has the advantage of you are the one who is buying the seed. You buy the varieties that you want, and you have transplants available when you want them. But it requires space to grow the transplants, normally a greenhouse, and specific knowledge of transplant production. In addition, it's going to require an additional 5 to 8 weeks of labor on the part of you as a grower if you grow your own transplants instead of purchasing transplants from someone else's greenhouse operation. Next month's class will focus more detail on transplant production. As a beginning farmer, one of the things, particularly if you do not already own your land, if you're choosing a spot to begin an enterprise, what kinds of things do we look for when we're going to select a site that might be good for vegetable production? Well, we look at the soil type. We would like to have something that is fairly well drained, and we need to know what is the fertility level. And we will talk more about soils and fertilizers in classes that will come later in this course. But Soil type and fertility are important considerations for site selection. All soils are not equal in terms of their productivity and ability to grow vegetables. And in fact, in some cases, soil type can impact which crops can be successfully grown. If we're in a piece of property that is low in elevation and not well drained, then probably bell peppers, which are very subject to diseases like Phytophthora, won't be a good choice, and that particular soil type, and particularly if it's in a poorly drained area, it's going to dictate, that we probably not raise bell peppers. Additionally, when we think about site selection, we would like to know the cropping history, what has been grown on this field in the past, and in particular, what herbicides have been used. In many cases, herbicides can carry over for 2 or more years and cause damage to subsequent crops. So we need to know what the crops were that have been produced on this site and what the herbicides were that were used. Additionally, we would like to look at site elevation. If we look at upland hilltop kinds of ground, those tend to be much better for early spring production or late fall production. Cold air, much like water, runs downhill, and so elevated sites tend to be warmer in the spring and fall of the year. And so if we're wanting to produce crops early or late in the growing season, we would like to have a site that is elevated above adjacent grounds. Pest management is another item that will consume a great amount of time for the typical vegetable grower in Illinois. And by pest, we look at things like weed, disease, and insect control. Integrated pest management practices are most commonly used in the state, and IPM, or integrated pest management, is essential to growing high-quality produce. We never rely upon a single control option, but we use many different options, and we only treat when conditions are such that failure to do so would result in economic losses. We try to rely on a variety of tactics. For example, in the case of weed control, we may use chemical herbicides, but in addition, we may practice cultivation, tillage, hand weeding, the use of mulches, both synthetic like plastic or organic like straw or wood chips. We will also utilize old practices like crop rotation and mowing, in some cases as part of the weed control program for specific vegetables. Flaming is an option that is often used for organic weed control methods. In terms of insect control, we may rely on chemical insecticides. They can be organic or synthetic. We may also look at the use of row covers to keep the insect pest from getting to the crop. And again, rotation, for example, in the case of things like Colorado potato beetle or squash vine borer, may be very useful tools as part of the entire arsenal of what we are relying upon in order to obtain good insect control. We may even do some hand picking in the case of things like hornworm on tomatoes, for example. Disease control, again, the utilization of chemical fungicides, either synthetic or organic. We also would like to use disease-free seed, and in many cases that means that it's actually certified. And we would also like to utilize resistant varieties when those options are available, again assuming that that resistant variety has the horticultural characteristics that are required for us to successfully produce and market the crop in question. Disease control also tends to benefit from rotation, and practicing good sanitation is another valuable tool in the disease control program. In other words, we don't go from an infected field, take our equipment, and then go and work a clean field. We practice good sanitation. Here's a list of some of the crop families, and we mentioned rotation earlier, and it's a good practice whenever possible to try to rotate and have a 3-year rotation between one family until we plant that same plant family back on a piece of property. This isn't always possible, and there are some ways to address issues that arise when we are unable to practice rotation. But if all things are equal and rotation is an option, it is a great idea to practice good crop rotation. And again, Be careful that you rotate crop families and not just crop. For example, in the allium group, onions, garlic, shallots, and leeks, as well as others, are all in the same plant family. I think a better example down here would be in the solanaceous crop. Tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, and eggplants are all in the same plant family. So this field had potatoes on it this year. If we put peppers on it next year, or tomatoes or eggplant, we in fact have not actually rotated. Even though we are growing a different crop, we're still in the same plant family. And we would like to rotate so that we are putting different families on and leaving 3-year space from when we plant the family until we plant it again. In addition to plant families, it's also important to look at what the disease is that we're trying to control by rotation. For example, some things like Phytophthora or Verticillium have a very wide host range, and if we're going to try to utilize crop rotation as a mechanism for control, we have to be very careful about what plant family we rotate back to find a family that is in fact not susceptible. Assuming we've done a good job with our site selection, variety selection, pest management, at some point we're going to get to where it's time to do crop harvest. And at what stage you harvest a crop will vary somewhat depending on personal preference, but in general, growers should bear in mind that the market may dictate. If you think that sweet corn maybe is best when it's a little bit tender, but most of the people at the farmer's market like a larger ear of sweet corn, it's probably those people at the marketplace that are going to dictate when it is that is the best time for harvesting your commodity. Regardless of that, it's best to harvest early in the morning. That allows us to not have the heat of the day in the produce when we pick it, and for most things it's better to get them inside and cooled down as quickly as possible. In general, cooler produce will last much longer and have better shelf life than produce that is allowed to remain warm. For most crops, harvest as close to ripe as possible. This allows us to have the very best in flavor. Make sure that the crop that you're harvesting is being picked at the correct stage. For example, we have all seen pictures in the county paper where someone has picked a 10-foot or a 10-pound zucchini squash. Well, it's not actually fit to eat. So make sure that what you're harvesting is at the correct stage for the crop that you are harvesting. In addition, be prepared to provide adequate post-harvest storage conditions appropriate for the crop being handled. In the case of things like tomatoes and peaches, we may only want to cool those down to 55, 57, 58 degrees, somewhere in that range. And other commodities like sweet corn, we would like to get down to 33 or 34 degrees. So we will talk more about this topic also in subsequent classes, but just be aware of the fact that different crops have different post-harvest handling that is required. Make sure you've looked it up and you're treating your crop in an. Here are some of the expenses associated with vegetable crops. Large expenses would include things like seed or plants, fertilizer, pesticides, and expenses associated with machinery, fuel, and land. In general, vegetables are much cheaper to produce than fruit. Fruit crops can cost in excess of $7,000 per acre in terms of their input expenses, while most vegetables would be significantly less than this. Labor will be a significant input cost, and in some cases this may be solely supplied by you or by hiring others. Additionally, there will likely be marketing costs, and they can include things like market fees or what it costs for the packaging that you're going to sell your commodity in. We will also have probably some advertising costs, and we may have costs associated with what it costs to build our roadside stand or those kinds of things. You need to keep track of all of your expenses to make sure that you don't sell too cheap. You've got to know what your costs are and make sure that you're getting a return on your investment in your vegetable. These are some of the possible gross returns from various vegetable crops, and this is based on the average price received in the year 2013 at the Quincy Farmers Market. But there's a variety of crops and the average price. And when we go back and look at what we would anticipate in terms of yield, it gives us a gross income per 100 foot of row. And here the chart continues with some additional vegetable crops. If you would like information from a larger scale, you can go to any one of several websites. One of the closer states that operates a significant budget enterprise database for specialty crops would be the University of Kentucky, and you can see the web address in the bar here. But the University of Kentucky's Center for Crop Diversification has a number of budgets that have been developed by the University of Kentucky, and additionally they also have some links to other states like Ohio State, which also have commercial specialty crop enterprise budget worksheets that you can utilize. And you'd be highly encouraged to look at these and do your homework prior to deciding you want to get into the vegetable production. There are a ton of really good references that are available. In the beginning, one of the better ones is simply Vegetable Gardening in the Midwest. It is a nice collection of a lot of the vegetable crops that can be grown in the state of Illinois, and it gives some background information in terms of cultural requirements for each of those vegetables. Something that will become your Bible as you get larger and more experienced will be the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide for commercial growers, and this is available either for purchase or you can download the PDF electronically from the website that's listed here. But this book will go through, in the beginning it gives you some overview information on vegetable crop production, and then it's followed by pages and pages of specific crop information. And this particular one is for much of the Midwest. There are other states that have their own production guides that are also quite useful. For example, the University. Here's a list of some additional resources or locations you can go to obtain more information about, in some cases, vegetable gardening, and in most cases, in commercial vegetable production. Again, my name is Jeff Kinehart, and this slide set was made in conjunction with Mike and Nathan. If you would like any more additional information, please feel free to contact any of us listed on this slide set. Thank you for your time. Have a great day.